Chapter 1. The Widow's Warning. The small village of St. Mary Mead was known for its quaint charm, its winding lanes, and the quiet lives of its residents. To the casual observer, it might appear to be the picture of serenity, a place untouched by the complexities of the outside world. But as Miss Marple well knew, there was often more to a seemingly innocent village than met the eye, and it was in this village, on a crisp autumn morning, that a mystery began to unfurl, a mystery that would soon have Miss Marple's keen eyes scrutinizing every detail. The story began, as many do, with a funeral. The widow, Mrs. Harriet Wren, had lived a long life, outliving 2 husbands and bearing the weight of many whispered rumours. She was a woman of some means, her wealth accumulated through a marriage to the late Sir Edgar Wren, a man whose reputation had once been above reproach. But now, as the mourners gathered around her casket, it was not Sir Edgar's memory that lingered most in the minds of the villagers, but that of his wife. There had been talk, of course. The widow had lived alone in the old Wren Manor house for many years, and it was said that she kept to herself, her demeanour cold and aloof. But despite her reclusive nature, Mrs. Wren had a reputation for one peculiar thing, her lace collection. The most stunning pieces of lace, handed down through generations, were her pride and joy. She would often show them to visitors, her fingers lightly brushing the delicate threads as if the very fabric held some secret. Among the residents of St. Mary Mead, however, it was widely believed that the lace was cursed. There were stories of the unfortunate fate that befell those who dared to come too close to it. And yet Mrs. Wren never seemed to care about such things. It was, after all, just superstition. But on the day of her funeral, things began to take an unusual turn. Miss Marple, standing at the back of the gathering, her sharp eyes observing every movement, noticed something curious. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, the wind seemed to pick up, rustling through the trees in an eerie, unsettling manner. The air was heavy, and an inexplicable chill swept through the crowd. Then, just as the final prayer was said, a figure appeared from the nearby woods. A young woman, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, stepped forward, her footsteps steady but determined. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as the woman approached the grave, her gaze fixed on the casket. She carried with her something wrapped in a black cloth, and though she moved with grace, there was a tension in her posture, as if she were walking into something far more than a mere funeral. The woman knelt by the grave, her lips moving in a whispered prayer that was lost to the wind. But it was the object she held in her hands that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was a piece of lace, the same intricate design that Mrs. Wren had often shown to her visitors. The young woman placed it gently atop the grave, her fingers lingering over the delicate fabric before she stood and walked away without a word. Miss Marple stood for a moment, pondering the woman's actions. She had seen the lace before, of course, but why had this stranger chosen to lay it over Mrs. Wren's grave? What was the significance of this ritual? The questions lingered in her mind as she made her way back to her small cottage, her thoughts turning over the events she had just witnessed. The following days passed with the usual calm of the village, but Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. She learned from a local shopkeeper that the woman who had placed the lace on the grave was none other than Agnes Ford, a distant relative of Mrs. Wren's late first husband. Agnes had recently arrived in St. Mary Mead, having spent many years abroad. Her return to the village had been sudden, and it was whispered that she had come to settle some old family matters. But what business could she have had with Mrs. Wren's funeral? And why the lace? Determined to uncover the truth, Miss Marple set about speaking to the villagers who had known Mrs. Wren best. The widow's lace collection, it seemed, had been the subject of much gossip, but few had ever dared to speak of it openly. Some believed it had been passed down from a long line of women who had met untimely deaths, while others claimed that the lace had been tied to dark dealings and family secrets. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust rumours alone. She would need to find the facts that were hidden just beneath the surface of the village's quiet facade. As Miss Marple pondered the mystery of the lace, she also kept a close watch on Agnes Ford. The young woman's visit to the grave had not been an innocent gesture. Miss Marple was certain of that. The curse of the widow's lace was no mere superstition, and Agnes Ford's arrival in St. Mary Mead might not have been as casual as it appeared, but the question remained: what was the connection between Agnes Ford and the lace, and why had she chosen to return to the village now, after so many years? Miss Marple knew one thing for certain: there was more to this mystery than met the eye. With the first chapter of the widow's curse unfolding before her, Miss Marple set out to dig deeper, certain that the truth was buried somewhere beneath the surface of this quiet village. And as always, she would stop at nothing to uncover it. Chapter 2. The Whispering Lace. The morning after Mrs. Wren's funeral dawned cool and grey, the kind of morning that made even the most optimistic of villagers feel as if the sun had forgotten to rise. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred by the dreariness of the day. She had a plan in mind, a plan to uncover the truth behind the strange behaviour of Agnes Ford, the mysterious woman who had placed the widow's lace on the grave. The lace, with its intricate design and whispered curse, seemed to have more to it than mere superstition, and Miss Marple knew that when it came to mysteries in small villages like St. Mary Mead, there was often more to uncover than anyone would first suspect. Her first stop was the village's oldest library, tucked away in a quiet corner near the post office. It was a small, ivy-covered building that housed generations of stories and forgotten secrets. The librarian, Miss Luella Briggs, was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an impeccable memory. She had been working in the library for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and had always been a source of valuable information, though sometimes one had to sift through her endless chatter to find it. "Ah, Miss Marple," Miss Briggs said as she adjusted her glasses and peered over the top of a dusty book. "What brings you to my humble domain this fine morning?" "Good morning, Miss Briggs," Miss Marple replied with a polite smile. "I was hoping you might have some information on the history of the widow's lace. It seems to have a curious reputation around here." Miss Briggs's expression tightened at the mention of the lace. She set down the book she was holding and folded her hands in her lap. "Ah, yes, the widow's lace. A most curious item indeed. It's been part of the Wren family for generations, passed down through the women of the house. But I must warn you, Miss Marple, there's more to that lace than meets the eye. It's not just a collection of fine needlework. It carries with it a certain heaviness." Miss Marple sat down across from Miss Briggs, her eyes narrowing in interest. "What do you mean by heaviness?" Miss Briggs leaned in closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "It's said that every woman in the Wren family who has owned that lace has met a tragic end. Some say it's a curse. Others believe it's the result of bad luck. But the coincidences are too many to ignore." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And you believe in such things, Miss Briggs?" "Not personally, no," Miss Briggs replied with a sniff. "But I've lived here long enough to know that there's always something to the stories people tell. The lace was once kept locked away in a cabinet, but after Mrs. Wren's husband, Sir Edgar, died, she began showing it off to anyone who came to visit. It's as if she wanted to prove something, or perhaps she was just waiting for the next tragedy to happen." Miss Marple sat back thoughtfully, her fingers tapping the edge of her teacup. "And what of Agnes Ford? She placed the lace on the grave, didn't she?" Miss Briggs's eyes narrowed. "Ah, yes, Agnes Ford. I must admit, I don't trust her. She's been away from the village for years, but now she's returned, and not without cause. I know she's related to Mrs. Wren, distantly, of course, but what is she doing here now? I suspect she has more to do with the lace than she's letting on." Miss Marple thanked Miss Briggs for the information and left the library with more questions than answers. The widow's lace was clearly central to this mystery, and Miss Marple was more determined than ever to uncover its secrets. Her next visit was to the Wren Manor, the large, imposing house that stood at the edge of the village. It was a grand structure, though its glory had faded with time. The gardens were overgrown, and the once gleaming windows now reflected a tarnished image of the house's former splendour. The current owner of the manor, Mrs. Wren's distant cousin, had recently opened the house to the public in an attempt to keep it afloat financially. He was a man of questionable character, known more for his gambling debts than his interest in maintaining the family estate. Miss Marple was greeted at the door by a young maid who led her through the darkened halls of the manor. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of aged wood lingered in every room. When they reached the drawing-room, Miss Marple was surprised to find a portrait of Mrs. Wren hanging above the fireplace, her eyes cold and distant. "She always insisted on keeping this here," the maid explained. "Even after Sir Edgar passed, said it was a reminder of the family's history." Miss Marple studied the portrait carefully, noting the faint smile on Mrs. Wren's lips. There was something unsettling about the woman's expression, as if she were hiding a secret, or perhaps warning those who gazed upon it of something far darker. "Have you heard of the widow's lace, my dear?" Miss Marple asked casually, turning her attention to the maid. The young woman looked uncomfortable. "Oh, yes, the lace. Everyone talks about it. My grandmother told me stories about it when I was a little girl. She always said that no one should go near it." "And why is that?" Miss Marple inquired, her interest piqued. "I don't know, ma'am. Just that it brings bad luck. No one in our family ever touched it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She could feel the weight of the mystery growing heavier by the minute. Something was amiss, and it all seemed to centre around that cursed lace. After a brief conversation with the maid, Miss Marple left the manor and walked through the village, her mind spinning with the revelations of the day. Agnes Ford, the lace, the whispers of tragedy. There was a connection here, one that she would need to uncover if she were to solve the mystery. That evening, as she sat in her cosy cottage, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of an answer. The widow's lace, it seemed, was not just a piece of family heirloom. It was a symbol of something darker, something that had plagued the Wren family for generations. And Agnes Ford, with her mysterious arrival in the village and her strange behaviour at the funeral, was undoubtedly at the centre of it all. As Miss Marple's sharp mind worked through the clues, she could not help but feel that the curse of the widow's lace was not as simple as it appeared. It was a puzzle that, in due time, she would piece together. But for now, she could only wait for the next step in this mysterious game. And when it came, Miss Marple knew she would. Be ready. Chapter 3. The Web of Secrets. The following days in St. Mary Mead brought an unusual stillness, the kind of quiet that made Miss Marple's senses tingle with the anticipation of something just out of reach. The mystery surrounding the widow's lace had begun to unfold, but it was clear that the answers were not going to be easily uncovered. Agnes Ford, who had appeared in the village under the shadow of the lace's curse, remained a mystery in herself. Miss Marple, always keen to observe the subtle shifts in human behaviour, had no intention of letting this case slip away without a thorough investigation. The first step in unravelling the tangled threads of this mystery was to learn more about Agnes Ford. While Miss Marple had already spoken to Miss Briggs in the library, and had made her way through the decaying halls of the Wren Manor, she still had not fully understood why Agnes had returned after so many years away. There was something deeply calculated about the way she had placed the lace on Mrs. Wren's grave, an action that seemed to carry a weight far greater than mere tribute. Miss Marple's inquiries led her to the local inn, where Agnes was staying. The innkeeper, a man named Mr. Charles Prescott, was a stout, round fellow with a perpetually grumbling disposition. He ran the inn with an air of authority, though it was clear that the business had seen better days. The village of St. Mary Mead was small and tranquil, and not many travellers passed through. It was not often that a guest like Agnes Ford appeared, and Mr. Prescott's curiosity was piqued as much as anyone's. "She's a quiet one," Mr. Prescott said as he wiped down the counter. "Keeps to herself, stays in her room mostly, comes down for her meals, but she doesn't talk much. I've never known her to entertain anyone." Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "And has she mentioned why she's come to St. Mary Mead?" Mr. Prescott looked uneasy. "She's been here for a few weeks now. Said she was just passing through, but, well, you know how it is. People always say that when they don't want to give a straight answer. But I reckon she's here for something more than just a visit. She's been poking around the village, asking about the Wren family, particularly Mrs. Harriet Wren and her late husband." "That's most curious," Miss Marple mused. "What else can you tell me about her?" "She's an odd one, miss," he continued, lowering his voice. "She seems to have a particular interest in the family heirlooms, the lace, and I've heard her talking to herself sometimes, muttering things about retribution and family honour." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Reputation? What kind of reputation does she speak of?" "Now, I wouldn't know the details, but it's clear that there's something about the Wrens that still hangs over her. There's bitterness in her voice, though she tries to hide it behind that calm exterior of hers. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Prescott for the information and left the inn with more questions than answers. The mention of family honour and retribution hinted at a much deeper motive behind Agnes's visit to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had long known that vengeance was a powerful motivator, and it was not beyond the realm of possibility that Agnes had returned to right some old wrong. Whether that wrong had anything to do with the widow's lace remained to be seen. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, sipping her tea, she mulled over the bits of information she had gathered. Agnes's arrival, her interest in the lace, her cryptic remarks about retribution. Each clue led her down a path that seemed to circle back to the Wren family's past. It was time to speak with someone who knew the family history more intimately. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Edith Tolland, the village's oldest resident. Mrs. Tolland had been a close friend of Mrs. Wren's late first husband, Sir Edgar Wren, and had lived through many of the village's more scandalous events. A woman of great age and wisdom, Mrs. Tolland was not easily fooled, and her memory, though somewhat clouded by time, still held a wealth of knowledge. "Ah, Miss Marple, it's been a while," Mrs. Tolland said, her voice rasping with age. "What brings you to my humble abode today?" "I'm investigating a matter, Mrs. Tolland," Miss Marple replied, sitting across from the elderly woman. "It concerns the Wren family, particularly their late matriarch, Mrs. Harriet Wren, and her heirloom lace. I was hoping you could shed some light on the family's past." Mrs. Tolland's expression darkened at the mention of the lace. "The widow's lace? It's a cursed thing, Miss Marple. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've lived long enough to know that no good ever comes from such things." Miss Marple leaned forward. "But the curse, Mrs. Tolland, what can you tell me about it?" "The curse began long before Mrs. Wren ever laid claim to that lace," Mrs. Tolland continued, her voice low. "The Wren family has always been plagued by misfortune. Edgar Wren, he was a good man, but his family was full of dark secrets. It was said that their wealth came at the cost of something far more valuable, their honour." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. "What do you mean by honour, Mrs. Tolland?" "Ah, Miss Marple, it's a long tale, one of betrayal and deceit. You see, Sir Edgar's first wife, a woman named Margaret, was a kind and gentle soul, but when she died under mysterious circumstances, Sir Edgar married again, to a woman who was not so innocent. Mrs. Harriet Wren, as she became, was a woman with her own ambitions. She was rumoured to have been involved in darker dealings, ones that Sir Edgar could never quite escape from." Miss Marple's mind raced. "And the lace? Where does that fit into all of this?" "The lace was a gift to Sir Edgar's first wife, Margaret," Mrs. Tolland explained. "It was said to be a symbol of purity and grace. But after Margaret's death, it passed into Harriet's hands. Some say it was at that point that the curse began, when Harriet, with her ambition and her cold heart, took possession of the lace and the Wren family's fortune. It's been downhill ever since." Miss Marple sat back, digesting this new information. It seemed that Agnes Ford's return to St. Mary Mead was no coincidence. She had come to uncover, or perhaps to settle, a score that had been left unresolved for far too long. But why the lace? Why was it so important to her? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to Agnes Ford at the inn. She found her sitting alone at a table by the window, gazing out at the village street. Her eyes were dark, her expression distant, as if she were lost in thought. "Miss Ford," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm, "I understand that you've come to St. Mary Mead to revisit some old family matters. I'd like to know more about your connection to the Wren family." Agnes's gaze flicked toward Miss Marple, and for a moment there was a flicker of something like recognition in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the same cold exterior she had worn since her arrival. "I'm not interested in discussing family matters with a stranger," Agnes replied curtly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not a stranger, Miss Ford," Miss Marple said, leaning in slightly, "but I believe you have come here for a reason, and I believe that reason is tied to the curse of the widow's lace." Agnes's face stiffened, and she stood up abruptly. "I think you're mistaken, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "I'm simply here to pay my respects. That's all." Miss Marple watched her leave, her suspicions growing. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but there was still much to uncover. Agnes Ford, the Wren family's dark past, the lace and the curse. They were all connected in ways Miss Marple could only begin to understand. But she knew one thing for certain. She was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 3. The Web of Secrets. The following days in St. Mary Mead brought an unusual stillness, the kind of quiet that made Miss Marple's senses tingle with the anticipation of something just out of reach. The mystery surrounding the widow's lace had begun to unfold, but it was clear that the answers were not going to be easily uncovered. Agnes Ford, who had appeared in the village under the shadow of the lace's curse, remained a mystery in herself. Miss Marple, always keen to observe the subtle shifts in human behaviour, had no intention of letting this case slip away without a thorough investigation. The first step in unravelling the tangled threads of this mystery was to learn more about Agnes Ford. While Miss Marple had already spoken to Miss Briggs in the library and had made her way through the decaying halls of the Wren Manor, she still had not fully understood why Agnes had returned after so many years away. There was something deeply calculated about the way she had placed the lace on Mrs. Wren's grave, an action that seemed to carry a weight far greater than mere tribute. Miss Marple's inquiries led her to the local inn, where Agnes was staying. The innkeeper, a man named Mr. Charles Prescott, was a stout, round fellow with a perpetually grumbling disposition. He ran the inn with an air of authority, though it was clear that the business had seen better days. The village of St. Mary Mead was small and tranquil, and not many travellers passed through. It was not often that a guest like Agnes Ford appeared, and Mr. Prescott's curiosity was piqued as much as anyone's. "She's a quiet one," Mr. Prescott said as he wiped down the counter. "Keeps to herself, stays in her room mostly, comes down for her meals, but she doesn't talk much. I've never known her to entertain anyone." Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "And has she mentioned why she's come to St. Mary Mead?" Mr. Prescott looked uneasy. "She's been here for a few weeks now. Said she was just passing through, but, well, you know how it is. People always say that when they don't want to give a straight answer. But I reckon she's here for something more than just a visit. She's been poking around the village, asking about the Wren family, particularly Mrs. Harriet Wren and her late husband." "That's most curious," Miss Marple mused. What else can you tell me about her?" "She's an odd one, miss," he continued, lowering his voice. "She seems to have a particular interest in the family heirlooms, the lace. And I've heard her talking to herself sometimes, muttering things about retribution and family honour." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Reputation? What kind of reputation does she speak of?" "Now, I wouldn't know the details, but it's clear that there's something about the Wrens that still hangs over her. There's bitterness in her voice, though she tries to hide it behind that calm exterior of hers." Miss Marple thanked Mr. Prescott for the information and left the inn with more questions than answers. The mention of family honour and retribution hinted at a much deeper motive behind Agnes's visit to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had long known that vengeance was a powerful motivator, and it was not beyond the realm of possibility that Agnes had returned to right some old wrong. Whether that wrong had anything to do with the widow's lace remained to be seen. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, sipping her tea, she mulled over the bits of information she had gathered. Agnes's arrival, her interest in the lace, her cryptic remarks about retribution. Each clue led her down a path that seemed to circle back to the Wren family's past. It was time to speak with someone who knew the family history more intimately. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Edith Tolland, the village's oldest resident. Mrs. Tolland had been a close friend of Mrs. Wren's late first husband, Sir Edgar Wren, and had lived through many of the village's more scandalous events. A woman of great age and wisdom, Mrs. Tolland was not easily fooled, and her memory, though somewhat clouded by time, still held a wealth of knowledge. "Ah, Miss Marple, it's been a while," Mrs. Tolland said, her voice rasping with age. "What brings you to my humble abode today?" "I'm investigating a matter, Mrs. Tolland," Miss Marple replied, sitting across from the elderly woman. "It concerns the Wren family, particularly their late matriarch, Mrs. Harriet Wren, and her heirloom lace. I was hoping you could shed some light on the family's past." Mrs. Tolland's expression darkened at the mention of the lace. "The widow's lace? It's a cursed thing, Miss Marple. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've lived long enough to know that no good ever comes from such things." Miss Marple leaned forward. "But the curse, Mrs. Tolland, what can you tell me about it?" "The curse began long before Mrs. Wren ever laid claim to that lace," Mrs. Tolland continued, her voice low. "The Wren family has always been plagued by misfortune. Edgar Wren, he was a good man, but his family was full of dark secrets. It was said that their wealth came at the cost of something far more valuable, their honour." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. "What do you mean by honour, Mrs. Tolland?" "Ah, Miss Marple, it's a long tale, one of betrayal and deceit. You see, Sir Edgar's first wife, a woman named Margaret, was a kind and gentle soul. But when she died under mysterious circumstances, Sir Edgar married again, to a woman who was not so innocent. Mrs. Harriet Wren, as she became, was a woman with her own ambitions. She was rumoured to have been involved in darker dealings, ones that Sir Edgar could never quite escape from." Miss Marple's mind raced. "And the lace? Where does that fit into all of this?" "The lace was a gift to Sir Edgar's first wife, Margaret," Mrs. Tolland explained. "It was said to be a symbol of purity and grace. But after Margaret's death, it passed into Harriet's hands. Some say it was at that point that the curse began, when Harriet, with her ambition and her cold heart, took possession of the lace and the Wren family's fortune. It's been downhill ever since. Miss Marple sat back, digesting this new information. It seemed that Agnes Ford's return to St. Mary Mead was no coincidence. She had come to uncover, or perhaps to settle, a score that had been left unresolved for far too long. But why the lace? Why was it so important to her? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to Agnes Ford at the inn. She found her sitting alone at a table by the window, gazing out at the village street. Her eyes were dark, her expression distant, as if she were lost in thought. "Miss Ford," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm, "I understand that you've come to St. Mary Mead to revisit some old family matters. I'd like to know more about your connection to the Wren family." Agnes's gaze flicked toward Miss Marple, and for a moment there was a flicker of something like recognition in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the same cold exterior she had worn since her arrival. "I'm not interested in discussing family matters with a stranger," Agnes replied curtly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not a stranger, Miss Ford," Miss Marple said, leaning in slightly. "But I believe you have come here for a reason, and I believe that reason is tied to the curse of the widow's lace." Agnes's face stiffened, and she stood up abruptly. "I think you're mistaken, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "I'm simply here to pay my respects. That's all." Miss Marple watched her leave, her suspicions growing. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but there was still much to uncover. Agnes Ford, the Wren family's dark past, the lace and the curse. They were all connected in ways Miss Marple could only begin to understand. But she knew one thing for certain. She was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 4. The Past Returns. The crisp morning air of St. Mary Mead carried with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, a reminder that the village, though quiet, was ever-changing with the passage of time. The mystery that had begun with the widow's lace was now intertwined with the village's very history, and Miss Marple could feel herself drawing closer to a solution. She knew that the past, as it so often did, held the key to understanding the present. Over the past few days, Miss Marple had gathered enough information to begin piecing together the puzzle. Agnes Ford's arrival in St. Mary Mead, her interest in the Wren family, and the ominous mention of the widow's lace were not isolated events. No, they were part of a much larger, more intricate story, one that began long before Agnes set foot in the village. Miss Marple had learned from Mrs. Tolland that the Wren family was no stranger to scandal. Sir Edgar Wren's first wife, Margaret, had been beloved by the village, but her untimely death had cast a shadow over the family. Whispers of foul play had followed her passing, but no one had ever been able to prove anything. Then came Mrs. Harriet Wren, a woman whose ambitions and cold demeanour had made her a figure of suspicion in her own right. And when she took possession of the lace, a gift that had once symbolized purity, it was as if the very fabric of the Wren family's legacy became tainted. But it was Agnes Ford, with her quiet determination and her cryptic comments, who seemed to hold the key to unlocking the family's darkest secrets. Miss Marple had not yet spoken directly to Agnes about her motives, but she was beginning to suspect that the woman's return was not simply a visit to pay respects. There was something more at play, something far more personal. Miss Marple's next step was to visit the Wren Manor once more. Though the manor was now in the hands of Mrs. Wren's distant cousin, it still held the weight of generations of family history. The estate had fallen into disrepair over the years, and its once glorious grounds had become overgrown with ivy and moss. Yet, despite its decay, the manor remained an imposing presence on the outskirts of the village, a reminder of the family's former grandeur. As Miss Marple approached the manor, she noticed a familiar figure standing in the front garden. Agnes Ford. The young woman was dressed in a dark coat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She stood motionless, staring up at the mansion as if lost in thought. There was an air of finality to her posture, as if she had reached a decision and was preparing for something important. Miss Marple approached her slowly, taking care not to startle her. "Miss Ford," she said, her voice calm and composed, "I thought I might find you here." Agnes turned at the sound of Miss Marple's voice, her expression guarded. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" "I was hoping we could have a word," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "About the Wren family, about the lace." Agnes's eyes flickered with something, anger, frustration, or perhaps regret, but she said nothing for a long moment. Finally she sighed and motioned for Miss Marple to follow her toward a bench under a large oak tree. "Fine," Agnes said. "I'll tell you what you want to know, but don't expect any sympathy from me." Miss Marple sat beside her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'm not looking for sympathy, Miss Ford. I'm simply trying to understand the truth." Agnes took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak of things she had long kept hidden. "I didn't come to St. Mary Mead to pay respects. I came because I needed to settle something that's been haunting my family for years." Miss Marple listened intently, her eyes never leaving Agnes's face. "You see, my mother was the sister of Sir Edgar Wren's first wife, Margaret," Agnes continued. "When Margaret died, my family was devastated, not just by her death, but by what followed. There were rumours, whispers about Sir Edgar's involvement in her passing. No one ever spoke of it openly, but we all knew. My family lost everything after that. My mother never spoke about it, but I know she carried the weight of Margaret's death with her for the rest of her life." Agnes's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, the emotions she had long buried beginning to surface. "When I was younger, my mother would tell me stories about Margaret, how kind and beautiful she was, how her death had destroyed everything. But then there was Harriet. She came in, married Sir Edgar, and took over everything. The house, the fortune, the lace, and no one ever questioned it. Not openly, at least." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her expression thoughtful. "And the lace? What role did it play in all of this?" "The lace was Margaret's," Agnes replied, her eyes distant. "It was a gift from Sir Edgar, a symbol of his love for her. But when Margaret died, it became a symbol of loss, of betrayal. Harriet took it, of course. She didn't care about the sentiment. She just wanted to show it off, to prove that she had won." Agnes's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "But the lace, it wasn't just a piece of fabric. It became a symbol of everything that went wrong in our family. My mother hated it. She hated that it had passed to Harriet, and she hated the fact that no one ever questioned the way Margaret had died. Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing Agnes's words. And now you've come to St. Mary Mead to uncover the truth. Yes, Agnes said, her voice hardening. I've come to find out what really happened to Margaret, and I've come to settle the score. My family has suffered for too long because of this curse that Harriet brought into our lives with her greed and her ambition. The lace, it's a symbol of everything that went wrong, and I intend to make things right. Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, considering the weight of Agnes's words. It was clear that the young woman had been carrying the burden of her family's past for years. The curse of the widow's lace, it seemed, was not just a superstition. It was a living, breathing part of the Wren family's tragic history. But Miss Marple knew that the truth was rarely so simple. There was more to this story, more to uncover. Agnes's motives were clear, but they were only a part of the picture. The lace, the family history, and the mysterious death of Margaret Wren were all tangled together in a web of secrets that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. As the conversation ended and Agnes returned to the manor, Miss Marple stood and watched her go. The pieces were starting to come together, but the final truth remained elusive. There were still more questions to answer, and Miss Marple knew that the key to solving the mystery of the widow's lace lay hidden in the shadows of the Wren family's past. But for now, she would wait. The truth, as always, would reveal itself in time. Chapter 5. A Legacy of Shadows. The days following Miss Marple's conversation with Agnes Ford were filled with quiet anticipation. It seemed as though the whole village of St. Mary Mead was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The widow's lace was no longer just a family heirloom. It had become a symbol of something much darker, something that had shadowed the Wren family for generations. Miss Marple, as always, took a measured approach to her investigations. She knew that the truth was often buried beneath layers of pride, guilt, and secrecy, and the Wren family seemed to be an excellent example of this. The young woman, Agnes Ford, had come to the village to seek justice, but what form that justice would take remained unclear. Would she find retribution, or would she unearth something far more disturbing than she had bargained for? As the days passed, Miss Marple made it her mission to continue gathering information. She had already spoken to Mrs. Tolland, the village's oldest resident, and she had learned much about the Wren family's history, including the mysterious death of Margaret Wren and the arrival of Harriet, Sir Edgar's second wife. But there were still gaps in the story, unanswered questions that could only be filled by someone who had lived through those darker days. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit the churchyard once more. She had already paid her respects to Mrs. Wren's grave, but the atmosphere of the graveyard held a quiet pull on her, as though it contained answers to questions that had not yet been asked. It was here, among the tombstones, that the past seemed to whisper through the rustling of the trees, beckoning her to listen. As she wandered through the churchyard, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a particular grave, the one that belonged to Margaret Wren, Sir Edgar's first wife. The stone was simple, weathered with age, but still standing proudly amidst the other memorials. The inscription read, "Margaret Wren, beloved wife and mother, forever in our hearts." Miss Marple stood before the grave for a moment, pondering the woman's life. What had Margaret's death meant to the family? What had it meant to Agnes, who had grown up with the shadow of her aunt's death hanging over her? Margaret's life and death had clearly been the catalyst for the tensions that had festered within the Wren family. But the questions still lingered. Who had killed her, and why? And how did the widow's lace fit into all of this? As Miss Marple pondered these questions, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw none other than Agnes Ford herself, walking briskly toward the grave. Her face was set, her jaw clenched, and there was a sense of determination in her step. When she reached the grave, she paused, her gaze fixed on the inscription. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then, finally, Agnes spoke, her voice quiet and tense. "I never knew her," she said, her words barely more than a whisper. "Margaret, my aunt, but I feel like I've known her all my life. I've grown up with her death hanging over me, with the family's secrets buried deep. It's as though no one ever had the courage to speak her name openly." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "And now, Miss Ford, you seek to uncover the truth." Agnes nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the gravestone. "I need to know what happened to her. I need to know if my family was involved, if there's something I should have known all along. I need to understand why this curse hangs over us, why the lace, why it all matters." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice calm but firm. "You know, Miss Ford, that seeking the truth often comes at a great cost. The past has a way of revealing itself slowly, and sometimes the answers are more painful than we expect." Agnes turned to face her, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "I don't care about the pain, Miss Marple. I just need to know the truth. It's the only thing that can set me free." Miss Marple studied her carefully, seeing the depth of anguish in Agnes's expression. There was no doubting her determination, nor her belief that uncovering the truth would bring her the closure she so desperately sought. And yet Miss Marple knew all too well that the truth often had a way of shifting the ground beneath one's feet, leaving only confusion and regret in its wake. "I believe," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but certain, "that your quest for the truth will lead you down a path that you may not be prepared for. But I will assist you, as best I can, to understand the truth about Margaret Wren, about the lace, and about your family's past." Agnes's face softened for a moment, and she nodded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know what else to do. I've spent so many years feeling as though something was wrong, but I couldn't put it into words. Now I feel like I'm running out of time." Miss Marple's gaze hardened as she looked toward the horizon. "Time is often the one thing that we can never get back, Miss Ford. But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us when we least expect it." That evening, after her conversation with Agnes, Miss Marple retired to her cottage, her mind abuzz with the information she had gathered. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but there were still questions that lingered in the shadows. What had happened to Margaret Wren? What role had Sir Edgar and Harriet played in her death? And how had the widow's lace become so intertwined with the family's tragedy? As the night drew on, Miss Marple found herself growing more and more convinced that the answers she sought were closer than she had initially believed. Agnes Ford was right. Time was running out. The past had its grip on the present, and it was only a matter of time before it was forced into the light. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village's archives, hoping to find some clues that might shed light on Margaret Wren's death. The archives were tucked away in the back of the village hall, and Miss Marple knew the librarian, Mr. Alistair Fenton, would be more than happy to assist her. Mr. Fenton was a quiet, unassuming man who had worked in the archives for as long as Miss Marple could remember. He had a knack for finding things others had overlooked, and his knowledge of the village's history was unparalleled. "I'm looking for records related to Margaret Wren," Miss Marple said as she entered the archives, "particularly anything that might shed light on her death." Mr. Fenton looked up from his desk and nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll see what I can find." It took several hours of digging through old records and dusty ledgers, but eventually Mr. Fenton returned with a file containing newspaper clippings, personal letters, and official reports. As Miss Marple flipped through the pages, she found something that made her heart skip a beat. An autopsy report, dated several weeks after Margaret Wren's death. The cause of death, according to the report, had been listed as natural causes of a heart attack. But the words seemed hollow, and the file contained no mention of the circumstances surrounding her sudden passing. It was as if the authorities had decided that the matter was not worth further investigation. Miss Marple's mind raced as she read through the report. Something was not right. Margaret Wren's death had been sudden and unexpected, but the record suggested nothing more than a routine event. What had really happened to her? And why had the family closed ranks so quickly? There was more to this story, Miss Marple was sure of it. And as she tucked the file away and left the archives, she knew that her next move would be the most crucial one yet. Chapter 6. Beneath the Surface. The village of St. Mary Mead had always been a place where life moved at a leisurely pace. But the undercurrent of tension that had begun to stir over the past few weeks was undeniable. The more Miss Marple uncovered, the clearer it became that the mystery surrounding the Wren family and the curse of the widow's lace was far deeper than she had initially thought. After her visit to the archives, Miss Marple spent the following days quietly observing the movements of Agnes Ford. The young woman's every action seemed to be dictated by a single goal: to uncover the truth about her aunt, Margaret Wren, and the mysterious events surrounding her death. But Miss Marple knew that the pursuit of truth was rarely as straightforward as one might hope. There were always hidden layers, things left unsaid, and secrets buried in the past. As she sat by her fireplace, Miss Marple reflected on the information she had gathered so far. The autopsy report had raised more questions than it answered. A heart attack, they had said. But that explanation seemed too simple, too convenient. Miss Marple had seen enough to know that the truth often lay beneath the surface, hidden in the details that others overlooked. It was then that Miss Marple recalled something that Mrs. Tolland had said to her about Margaret Wren's death. The rumours that had swirled in the village at the time. Some claimed that Margaret had been in poor health for years, but others had whispered about a more sinister cause. It was these whispers that Miss Marple needed to explore further. The next morning, she made her way to the home of Dr. Timothy Harris, the village's only physician. Dr. Harris had been in St. Mary Mead for many years, and though he was a quiet man by nature, he had seen more than his share of strange occurrences over the years. If anyone knew the truth about Margaret Wren's death, it would be him. When Miss Marple arrived at Dr. Harris's modest house, she was greeted by his housekeeper, Mrs. Penelope Grant, who led her into the small sitting room where the doctor was reading the morning paper. "Ah, Miss Marple," Dr. Harris said, looking up with a warm smile. "What brings you here this fine day?" "I was hoping to speak with you about something, Dr. Harris," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat across from him. "It concerns Margaret Wren. You were, of course, her physician at the time of her death." Dr. Harris's expression darkened slightly, and he set the paper aside. "I see. You know, it's been many years since Margaret's passing. It was a difficult time for the village, and I've tried to put it all behind me." "I understand," Miss Marple said gently, "but I have reason to believe that the official cause of death may not have been the whole story. I've seen the autopsy report, and I must say it doesn't sit right with me. A heart attack, they say, but the circumstances of Margaret's death suggest there may have been more to it." Dr. Harris sighed, his hands clasped in front of him. "You're not the first to ask about it, Miss Marple. In fact, I've had several inquiries over the years, though none as direct as yours. The thing is, Margaret's death was sudden, yes, but it was also entirely in line with her health at the time. She'd been in poor condition for some time, and the heart attack was a likely outcome." "Poor condition?" Miss Marple repeated. "But was there nothing else? No signs of foul play?" Dr. Harris hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There were rumours, of course. The village is full of them, especially when something as tragic as Margaret's death occurs. But I can assure you, Miss Marple, that in my professional opinion, Margaret's death was not the result of anything but natural causes. She had a weak heart. Her health had been deteriorating for months." Miss Marple's mind raced as she listened to Dr. Harris's words. While he seemed sincere, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was being left out. She had seen enough to know that not everything was as it seemed, especially in matters of death. There were always unanswered questions, hidden motives and things that people were too afraid or too ashamed to speak of. "I appreciate your honesty, Dr. Harris," Miss Marple said slowly, her voice gentle. "But I must ask you, did you ever consider that Margaret's death might not have been as straightforward as you believed? That perhaps there was something more to it than just poor health?" Dr. Harris looked down at his hands. His expression conflicted. "I can't speak to what others might have thought, Miss Marple, but I stand by my diagnosis. There was no foul play. It was just a tragic natural event." Miss Marple stood up, her mind turning over the doctor's words. There was still something amiss, something in the air, a sense that the truth was being kept hidden. She thanked Dr. Harris for his time and left his house, her thoughts more unsettled than ever. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Dr. Harris was telling the truth, or whether he, too, had been complicit in hiding the real cause of Margaret Wren's death. If the heart attack had been the official cause, then why had the village been so reluctant to speak of it openly? What had been the true nature of the Wren family's tragedy? Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Wren Manor once more. This time she was determined to speak to the current owner, Mr. Richard Wren, the distant cousin of Harriet Wren. It was clear that the manor still held the secrets of the family's past, and Miss Marple was certain that Richard knew more than he was willing to admit. When Miss Marple arrived at the manor, she was greeted by a servant who led her through the grand decaying halls. The atmosphere was thick with dust and the weight of history. The manor had once been a symbol of wealth and power, but now it was little more than a relic of the past. Richard Wren, a tall, thin man in his late 50s, was waiting for her in the drawing-room. His appearance was unremarkable. Neatly dressed, his hair beginning to thin at the temples. But there was something in his eyes, a sharpness that Miss Marple could not ignore. "Miss Marple," Richard said, standing to greet her, "what brings you to my home today?" "I was hoping to speak with you about your family," Miss Marple replied, "specifically about your late aunt, Mrs. Harriet Wren, and the death of your cousin, Margaret Wren." Richard's face remained unreadable, but Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Margaret's death was a tragedy, Miss Marple, but I'm afraid there's nothing more to discuss. The cause was well documented, a heart attack, as you know." Miss Marple studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing. "But there are so many unanswered questions, Mr. Wren. The lace, for one, and the rumours that have swirled around your family for years. What really happened to Margaret?" Richard Wren's expression hardened, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered if he might close the door on her investigation entirely. But then, after a long pause, he sighed deeply and gestured toward a chair. "I don't know what you expect me to say, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "But I will tell you this. The truth about my family has been buried for years. Some things are better left in the past." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "Mr. Wren, sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and when it surfaces, it's never as clean as we would like it to be." Richard Wren met her gaze, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of something, regret perhaps, or fear, before he looked away. "I suggest you leave it be, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Some truths are too painful to uncover." Chapter 7. The Ghosts of the Past. Miss Marple stood in the shadow of Wren Manor, the heavy weight of Richard Wren's words still echoing in her mind. Some truths are too painful to uncover. His attempt to dismiss her inquiry had been clear, but Miss Marple was not one to be easily deterred. She had learned long ago that when people were determined to hide something, it often meant there was more to uncover beneath the surface. As she walked away from the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Agnes Ford, who seemed to be the only one truly seeking answers. Agnes had arrived in St. Mary Mead with a clear purpose, to uncover the truth about her aunt's death and the mysterious curse that had haunted the Wren family. But the more Miss Marple investigated, the more complicated the puzzle became. Richard Wren's reluctance to speak about the past, Dr. Harris's official diagnosis, and the strange atmosphere surrounding the widow's lace all pointed to something far darker than a mere natural death. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Agnes at the inn. The young woman had been quieter in the past few days, her determination still evident but tempered by an underlying unease. When Miss Marple entered the inn's small parlour, she found Agnes sitting by the window, gazing out at the village square. Miss Ford. Miss Marple greeted her softly, taking a seat across from her. "I trust you're well?" Agnes turned toward her, her expression weary, but still resolute. "Well enough, I suppose. The weight of it all is starting to settle in, Miss Marple, but I can't stop now. I have to know what happened to my aunt." "Understand," Miss Marple said, "and I think you may be closer to the truth than you realize. But I also believe there are things that you don't yet know, things that have been hidden for a long time." Agnes leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple's. "What do you mean? What else is there? I've spoken to Richard, to Dr. Harris, and everyone keeps telling me the same thing, that Margaret died of natural causes. But I don't believe it. Something isn't right." Miss Marple took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. "You're right to be suspicious, Miss Ford. The more I look into this, the more I believe that Margaret's death wasn't as simple as it appears. I've spoken to those who knew her, and there are too many inconsistencies in the story. But I think there's more to this than just your aunt's death. The widow's lace is at the heart of it all." Agnes's eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and realization. "The lace? You think it's connected to her death?" "I do," Miss Marple said. "The lace is not just an heirloom, not just a piece of family history. It represents something much darker. It has been passed down through generations, and each woman who has owned it has met with tragedy. Your Aunt Harriet Wren was no exception. But I believe that her death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning." Agnes sat back in her chair, processing Miss Marple's words. "But why would Harriet keep the lace after everything that happened? Why didn't she give it up if it was cursed?" "Because, Miss Ford," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm, "Harriet was not the woman you think she was. She didn't simply inherit the lace, she coveted it. And in her desire for power, for control over the Wren family legacy, she may have done things that we have yet to understand." Agnes's face hardened, her voice growing tense. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That Harriet murdered my aunt for the lace?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I'm not suggesting anything, Miss Ford. I'm only stating that we need to consider all possibilities. Margaret's death was too convenient, too sudden, and Harriet's actions in the years leading up to it raise questions about her true motives. I believe there is more to this story than anyone is willing to admit." A silence fell between them, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging heavily in the air. Agnes's hands clenched at her sides, her expression one of determination, mixed with fear. "So, what do we do now? How do we uncover the truth?" "We keep asking questions," Miss Marple replied. "We keep digging into the past, looking for clues that others have missed. The answers are here, in St. Mary Mead, buried beneath the weight of family secrets and old wounds." The next day Miss Marple returned to the village archives, where she had previously found the autopsy report. She knew there were still records she had not yet examined, documents that might hold the key to understanding what really happened to Margaret Wren. The archives, though quiet and often forgotten, were a treasure trove of the village's history, and Miss Marple was determined to leave no stone unturned. As she sifted through old records, she found several articles about Margaret's death, some from the Euf local newspaper, others from personal letters written by villagers who had known the Wren family. One article caught her attention. a brief mention of a discrepancy in the official report. It was a small note, almost hidden in the back of a page, but it was enough to pique Miss Marple's curiosity. The discrepancy referred to a second examination of Margaret's body, conducted by a different doctor after her death, but the results had been quietly suppressed. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she read the article again. A second examination? Why had this information been kept from the public? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it in their earlier conversations? Determined to follow this lead, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Harris once more. This time she found him in his office, examining a set of patient records. When Miss Marple entered, he looked up with a mixture of surprise and reluctance. "Miss Marple," he said with a sigh, "what brings you here again?" "I have a few more questions, Dr. Harris," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but insistent. "About Margaret Wren. I've come across a mention of a second examination of her body after her death. I'm wondering why this was never disclosed." Dr. Harris's face paled, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I see you've been doing your own investigating, Miss Marple. I was hoping this would all be left in the past." "But you didn't answer my question, Dr. Harris," Miss Marple pressed. "Why was the second examination suppressed? What did it reveal?" Dr. Harris hesitated before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The second examination revealed signs of poisoning. But it was inconclusive. We couldn't say for certain what had caused it, and it was never brought to light. I didn't think it was necessary. The family was already grieving. I didn't want to cause more distress." Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed this new information. Poisoning! It seemed to confirm her suspicions. The heart attack had been a convenient cover, a way to explain away the sudden death of Margaret Wren without looking too closely at the cause. "But you knew," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes fixed on Dr. Harris. "You knew there was something more, didn't you?" "I did," Dr. Harris admitted, his voice filled with regret. "But the family asked me to keep it quiet. They didn't want any more scandal. Harriet Wren, especially, insisted that it be swept under the rug. She didn't want anyone to know the truth. And so we buried it." Miss Marple stood up, her thoughts swirling with the implications of what she had just learned. The poisoning, the cover-up, and the role the widow's lace had played in it all. Everything was starting to make sense. Harriet Wren had been hiding a terrible secret, one that had cost Margaret her life. And now that secret was on the verge of being exposed. As Miss Marple left Dr. Harris's office, she knew that the time had come to confront Agnes Ford with the truth. The past had finally caught up with the present, and the answers they had both been seeking were no longer buried beneath layers of secrecy. The truth, as painful as it was, could no longer be hidden. Chapter 8. The Final Thread. The sun was setting over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets as Miss Marple made her way to the inn where Agnes Ford was staying. The weight of the truth she was about to reveal hung heavily on her shoulders, but Miss Marple knew that there was no turning back now. The secrets of the past had been buried for too long, and it was time for them to come to light. She had spent the past few days piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle, learning about the second autopsy, the signs of poisoning, and the role Harriet Wren had played in silencing the truth. Miss Marple's mind had been working relentlessly, as it always did when faced with a mystery. The pieces of the Wren family's tragic history had finally come together, revealing a dark and twisted legacy. The death of Margaret Wren had not been a simple accident or a result of natural causes. It had been murder, a murder that had been covered up for years. And now, the woman who had orchestrated that cover-up, Harriet Wren, was dead, her legacy tainted by her actions. But what of Agnes? What role did she play in all of this? As Miss Marple reached the inn, she found Agnes waiting in the small parlour. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes tired from the many sleepless nights spent searching for answers. When Agnes saw Miss Marple, she stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "what have you found? I can't bear this uncertainty any longer." Miss Marple took a deep breath and sat down across from Agnes, her eyes meeting the young woman's with an intensity that spoke volumes. "I've found the truth, Miss Ford," Miss Marple said gently. "The truth about your aunt, about the widow's lace, and about the tragic death that has haunted your family for so many years." Agnes's eyes widened with a mix of hope and fear. "The truth. What is it? Please, Miss Marple, tell me. I need to know." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "Margaret Wren did not die of a heart attack, as the official report claims. She was poisoned, Miss Ford. A second autopsy revealed traces of poison in her system. Poison that was administered slowly, over time. It was a deliberate act, one that took planning and care." Agnes's face drained of colour, her breath catching in her throat. "Poisoned? But who would do such a thing?" "Your aunt, Harriet Wren," Miss Marple replied, her voice unwavering. "Harriet wanted control. Control over the Wren estate, the family legacy, and the widow's lace. She saw Margaret as an obstacle to her power. And so she took matters into her own hands." Agnes's hands clenched into fists, her face a mask of disbelief. "Harriet? But why? She was my family. She raised me. How could she do this?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes, Miss Ford, family is the greatest source of conflict. Harriet was consumed by ambition and greed. The widow's lace, passed down through generations of Wren women, was more than just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of power, and Harriet was determined to possess it. She believed that by eliminating Margaret, she could secure her place as the head of the family, and she could claim the lace for herself." Agnes's voice trembled as she spoke. "But why didn't anyone say anything? Why didn't anyone stop her?" The Wren family was trapped in its own web of lies, Miss Marple explained. No one dared speak out against Harriet. She controlled the family with her coldness, her manipulation. And after Margaret's death, the rest of the family turned a blind eye. They didn't want to confront the truth, so they buried it, just as Harriet had buried it. The truth about Margaret's death was buried along with her. Agnes stared down at her hands, her mind reeling with the weight of what Miss Marple had just revealed. "I can't believe it. All these years, I thought, she was the one who cared about me. She took me in after my parents died. She raised me like her own. And now I learn that she's the one responsible for my aunt's death, that she murdered her." Miss Marple's gaze softened, her voice gentle. "It's a difficult truth to accept, Miss Ford. But sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can hurt us the most." Harriet's actions were driven by her own desires, and she was willing to sacrifice anything, including the life of your aunt, to get what she wanted. Agnes's face contorted with anger and pain. "I don't know what to do with this. Miss Marple, how can I live with this knowledge? How can I even look at my family the same way again?" Miss Marple placed a hand on Agnes's, her touch comforting but firm. "The truth is painful, Miss Ford, but it is also liberating. Now that you know, you can begin to heal. You can stop searching for answers in the past and start building a future that is not defined by the mistakes of those who came before you." Agnes looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "What should I do now?" "Now, Miss Ford," Miss Marple said with quiet resolve, "it is time to confront the past. The Wren family's legacy is tainted, but that does not mean you have to carry its burden. You have the power to let go of the past, to break free from the curse that has haunted your family for so long." Agnes nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "I won't let Harriet's actions define me. I won't let her control me any longer." Miss Marple smiled gently, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "That's the spirit, Miss Ford. The truth may be painful, but it is also the key to freedom. You no longer have to live in the shadow of the widow's lace. It is time to move forward." Miss Marple stood to leave. She paused at the door and turned to Agnes one last time. "Remember, Miss Ford, that you are not defined by your family's actions. You are your own person, and you have the power to create your own destiny." Agnes smiled faintly, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything." Miss Marple nodded and left the inn, her heart light with the satisfaction of a mystery solved and a young woman freed from the grip of her family's dark past. The truth, as painful as it had set Agnes Ford on the path to healing. And Miss Marple knew that in time the shadows of the widow's lace would fade, leaving behind only the clarity of truth and the promise of a brighter future. She walked back through the village, the evening air crisp and cool. Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of a job well done. The case was closed. The truth had been revealed. And St. Mary Mead, once again, could return to its quiet, peaceful existence, at least for now. Chapter 9. The Quiet Aftermath. The days following Agnes Ford's confrontation with the truth were quiet ones. The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on its peaceful nature, but for the first time in many years, the air was different. There was a new sense of calm that hung over the village, as if the weight of its secrets had finally been lifted, allowing the morning sunlight to filter through the cracks of the old, forgotten past. Miss Marple had watched Agnes with quiet concern over the past few days. The young woman had taken the revelation of her aunt's betrayal with a strength Miss Marple had not expected. But it was clear that the road to healing would be long. The weight of Harriet Wren's actions, the death of Margaret and the poisonous legacy that had stretched through generations, were not things that could be swept away so easily. As Miss Marple walked through the village, she could see the subtle changes in the people she passed, the whispered conversations, the sideways glances. All of it had stopped. It was as if the villagers, too, had been waiting for the truth to surface. And now that it had, they were ready to move on. There was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere, as though St. Mary Mead had been holding its breath for far too long, and was finally exhaling in relief. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an invitation. It was from Agnes Ford herself, who had requested a meeting at the inn. The young woman had not been entirely forthcoming about her plans in the days after the truth had come out, but Miss Marple had sensed that there was more to this than just closure. Agnes had something she wanted to say, and Miss Marple knew that after everything, the young woman needed to speak her truth aloud. When Miss Marple arrived at the inn, she was greeted by Agnes, who seemed different, lighter somehow, as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She led Miss Marple to a small, quiet room at the back of the inn, where the soft light of the setting sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," Agnes said, her voice filled with gratitude. I needed to speak with you. I've had time to think, and there are things I want to tell you. Things I didn't quite understand until now." Miss Marple took a seat across from Agnes, her expression gentle but expectant. "Of course, Miss Ford. What is it you wish to share?" Agnes took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "I've been thinking about my family, about what happened with Margaret and with Harriet. I thought I was looking for revenge, for justice, but now I see that what I truly wanted was closure. I wanted to understand what happened and why, but I also wanted to know how to move forward with my life. I can't live in the shadow of their mistakes forever." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "The past can be a heavy burden, Miss Ford, but you've already taken the first step toward freeing yourself from it." Agnes smiled faintly. "I thought that after I found the truth, I would feel, I don't know, relieved. But instead, I felt empty. It's strange. All these years, I carried around the weight of my family's secrets, and now that I know the truth, it doesn't feel like the end of it. It's just the beginning." Miss Marple regarded her carefully. "Sometimes knowing the truth doesn't provide the closure we expect, but it does give us the power to choose how we move forward." Agnes's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "I've decided to leave St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple. I think it's time for me to start over. I don't want to be tied to this place anymore. I don't want to carry the legacy of my family with me. I want to create my own future away from the shadows of the past." Miss Marple's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. "That is a brave decision, Miss Ford, and one that I believe will bring you the peace you seek." Agnes looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes bright with determination. "I've made peace with the past, I think, but I need to let go of it now. I can't let it define who I am or who I want to become. I have to move on, and I can't do that while staying here." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You are right, Miss Ford. The past has no place in the future unless we allow it to control us, and you have chosen not to let it control you. That is a remarkable strength." Agnes smiled, a real smile this time, one that carried with it the weight of the journey she had undertaken. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. You've helped me more than you know. You gave me the courage to face the truth, and now I'm ready to face the future." Miss Marple stood and walked over to Agnes, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You have a bright future ahead of you, Miss Ford, and I have no doubt that you will make it your own." The two women stood there for a moment, a quiet, understanding passing between them. Then, with a final nod, Miss Marple left the inn, knowing that her work in St. Mary Mead was done. The mystery of the widow's lace had been solved, and the ghosts of the Wren family's past had been laid to rest. As Miss Marple walked through the village, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case had been a difficult one, but, in the end, the truth had prevailed. Agnes Ford had found the closure she needed, and Miss Marple knew that in time she would find the peace she sought as well. The village was still as it always was, but it felt different now. Lighter, freer, the truth had come to light, and with it the promise of a new beginning. The curse of the widow's lace had been broken, and the shadows that had haunted St. Mary Mead for so long had finally dissipated. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the village, looking out over the quiet landscape. The case was closed. The mystery was solved. And for the first time in a long while, the village was at peace. Chapter 10. The Unbroken Thread. The air in St. Mary Mead had returned to its familiar calm. The village, once unsettled by secrets long buried, now exhaled in quiet relief. Life had resumed its slow, peaceful pace, and yet, for Miss Marple, the events of the past weeks remained vivid in her mind. The truth about the Wren family, the widow's lace, and Agnes Ford's search for justice had been revealed, and though there had been pain, there was also growth. The curse of the widow's lace had been broken, not by the destruction of the object itself, but by the courage of a young woman who chose to confront her past and reclaim her future. As Miss Marple sat by her fireplace that evening, her thoughts turned to Agnes. The young woman had left St. Mary Mead, as she had planned, seeking a new beginning far from the shadows of her family's legacy. It was a bittersweet departure, for Miss Marple had come to understand the depth of Agnes's pain and the strength it had taken for her to let go. But Miss Marple also knew that Agnes's journey was far from over. She had chosen the path of self-discovery, and though it was uncertain, it was hers to walk. And what of the widow's lace? Miss Marple knew that its significance had shifted over time. Once a symbol of the Wren family's power and legacy, it had now become a reminder of the destructive force of greed and ambition. Yet, in its quiet way, it had also been a catalyst for change. It had forced the Wren family to face its darkest secrets, and it had driven Agnes to search for the truth. In the end, the lace had lost its power, its curse broken by the very truth that had so long eluded the Wren family. The case was closed, but Miss Marple's thoughts were never far from the mysteries that lay just beneath the surface of every quiet village. There were always hidden stories, buried truths, and tangled threads waiting to be untangled. The world, Miss Marple knew, was filled with complexities, and her role was to watch, to observe, and to listen carefully to the quiet murmur of life unfolding. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the events that had transpired. She had known from the start that there was more to Agnes's search than met the eye. It wasn't just the mystery of Margaret Wren's death that had driven the young woman. It was the need for closure, the desire to understand the family she had inherited and the legacy that had been passed down through the generations. It was a journey of self-discovery, and one that had been fraught with difficulty and pain. But Miss Marple had seen it before. People seeking answers, desperate to make sense of the things that had shaped their lives. And in the end, the answers had come, not through vengeance or retribution, but through understanding. The past had not been erased, but it had been acknowledged, and that had been enough for Agnes to step forward and claim her own future. Miss Marple set down her cup and rose from her chair, walking to the window. The village lay before her, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. There was a sense of peace in the air now, a quiet understanding that the past, while never truly gone, no longer held the power to shape the present. And yet, Miss Marple knew there would always be more mysteries to uncover. There would always be more lives to observe, more threads to follow, and more secrets to unravel. The world was full of stories waiting to be told, and Miss Marple's role in it all was clear. As the last light of the day faded, Miss Marple looked out across the village one last time, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. The curse of the widow's lace had been lifted, but the thread of the past would never truly be broken. It would always remain, woven into the fabric of the present, reminding us all that the truth, no matter how long hidden, would eventually find its way to the surface.